Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. We actually start this time with one of our occasional features. It's called A Longer Look, and this time the focus is on Yemen. I have, over the past 10 years or so, occasionally brought up the war in Yemen, an on and off civil war, which has been marked by some shifting alliances and is sufficiently complicated that even trustworthy sources like the BBC, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker can't actually agree on all the details of the roots of the conflict and the roots of the particular incarnation, I should say, of the conflict, beyond the fact that it began in 2014 when Houthi rebels used the opening created by the overthrow of the government of 33-year strongman Ali Abdullah Saleh in favor of his deputy, Abdrabba Mansour Hadi, and used that opening to secure the northern province of Sada, and in 2014 seized the national capital of Sana'a. What everyone does agree on, however, is that since Saudi Arabia's intervention in that civil war in 2015, that war has become essentially a proxy war between the Saudis, with the United Arab Emirates as a junior partner, supporting the Hadi government on the one side, and Iran on the other, supporting the Houthi rebels. In other words, it's become a regional power struggle played out on the bodies of the Yemenis. Now, from the start, the U.S. has cast its lot with the Saudis, first through U.S. drone strikes that were supposedly aimed at terrorism in Yemen, strikes that actually began under the administration of George Bush League, but increased dramatically during the administration of the amazing Mr. O, and supported the Saudis later through the more direct involvement of continuing to sell arms and supply intelligence to Saudi Arabia, even as it became undeniable that the Saudis were committing war crimes in Yemen, blockading ports, blocking entry of food, medical supplies, and other humanitarian aid, and engaging in a campaign of bombing of civilians, including in hospitals, markets, and residential areas. As a result of this, Yemen is in the midst of the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. A 2018 report by Save the Children estimated that 85,000 Yemeni children had already starved to death. And just this October, the UN estimated that 100,000 children in southern Yemen alone could die of acute malnutrition if urgent humanitarian aid is not available. How bad is this? Well, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification is a multinational project to create and present a standard model, a standard scale for determining the intensity and extent of food insecurity and malnutrition. This is its map of the current food insecurity in Yemen. Yellow means stressed, orange means crisis, red means emergency. And this is its map of projected food insecurity for the first half of 2021. It is very bad, and it's getting worse. And now COVID-19 has hit Yemen and is spreading unchecked in a country marked by a decimated healthcare infrastructure and disrupted access to things like clean water, sanitary systems, sufficient nutrition, adequate shelter, and so on. Even before COVID hit, the nature of the Saudi-led war had become so obvious and so outrageous that in April 2019, Congress actually invoked the War Powers Act to try to put an end to our involvement in this. Tweety Pie vetoed it, and there wasn't sufficient support to override it. Since then, there have been several attempts to block arms sales to the Saudis. Support for that has increased each time it's come up, but still it has not yet been enough in order to actually block it. But now there could be some hope. Joe Biden, who was something of a dove in the Obama administration, having opposed the war in Libya and the surge in Afghanistan, comes into office having pledged to end unauthorized U.S. involvement in the Yemen war. Now, the problem here is that the word unauthorized leaves an awful lot of wiggle room. I mean, does it actually mean an end to arms sales plus an end to the provision of logistical support, targeting assistance, spare parts, and intelligence? Or does it just mean wanting Congress to sign off on what's already being done? We'll have to see, but at least for now, there is reason to think, there's reason to think we can do this, and that we can put an end to our part in this monstrosity. At the very least, there's more reason for hope than we've had in some time. By the way, in fairness, I will note that some of those other forms of assistance, particularly logistical support, have already been cut back in response to pressure from Congress and the public. But speaking of now, of the present moment, not to be denied his literal pound of flesh, a week after the election, when any sane person would know that he had lost, PewDiePie announced an intention to sell $23 billion worth of advanced weaponry to the Saudi ally in the war, their main ally, the United Arab Emirates, a sale that would include up to 50 F-35s. They're rushing to make it a done deal before January 20th, apparently concerned that any such sale would be questioned by the Biden administration, a concern given weight by the fact that a group of 29 arms control and human rights organizations have condemned the proposed sale, which certainly would give Biden a good deal of political cover in order to cancel it. But what may be even worse here, even worse than that sale, is that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is reportedly soon going to classify the Houthi rebels as a foreign terrorist organization, which would likely simply make matters worse by further restricting international aid efforts out of fear of being sanctioned by the United States and driving up the already unaffordable prices for things like food and other basic necessities, particularly in the Houthi-controlled areas, which now encompass something like 70% of the population of Yemen. Aid groups might try to find a workaround if this came up, but far less altruistic institutions like banks and shipping companies and so on, for them, a terrorist designation would probably deter them from any involvement in Yemen. Dave Hardin, a former top official at the US Agency for International Development, believes the moves could cause, quoting him, a full collapse of the economy and complete devaluation of the currency, while effectively ending imports of food and other necessary supplies. But the PewDiePie gangsters, in fact, they just don't care, because what this also would be is a poke in the eye to Iran, which again supports the Houthis. The hope is that this will anger the Iran enough to be a hindrance to Biden's attempt to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal, while being politically difficult for him to reverse for fear of being called soft on Iran. Frankly, he should realize he's going to be called that no matter what he does, and just go ahead and do the right thing. Withdraw all support from the Saudis and their allies about Yemen. If the arms deal with the UAE has been finalized, he should cancel it. He should call for a ceasefire, demand that humanitarian assistance be allowed in the country and contribute towards that aid. If the Houthis have been designated as terrorists, he should either revoke that or at least assure international aid groups that they will not receive repercussions from the United States from their work there, and acknowledge Congress's constitutional role in matters of war and peace. The latter of which is probably going to be the hardest for us to achieve. Look, you know how I feel about Joe Biden. I said I greeted his election not with enthusiasm, but with relief. But there are some ways in which he can be more than just not PewDiePie. He can even be pretty good in some cases if the deeds live up to the words. This could be one of them. For the sake of honor and humanity and the lives of tens of millions of Yemenis, I hope it will be. All right, moving on to something else. There's an outfit in Indiana called the International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association, or ILETA. Among the guidance documents they have circulated to police departments is something called Understanding Antifa and Urban Guerrilla Warfare, and it is chock-a-block with falsehoods and conspiracy theories about Antifa and Black Lives Matter. It claims, for example, that these groups, neither one of them has any intention to negotiate anything, but instead are, quote, revolutionary movements whose aims are to overthrow the U.S. government, while also labeling those who participated in the nationwide protest for civil rights and against police brutality over the summer as useful idiots who were working for hardcore trained terrorist troops. It even claims that BLM is supposedly funded by China and that money is then donated to the Democratic Party. In the face of complaints, Harvey Haddon, Alita's executive director, defended the document, dismissing the concerns as just a matter of opinion, only to later say that this document was actually the opinion of just a single member, even though the document says that some of those observations were taken from Afghanistan and Iraq war veterans who had seen these kind of terrorist groups in action doing their organizing, and so seemingly are to be regarded as experts on the matter, not just people with opinions. And by the way, Haddon also says that the Just One Person's Opinion document has actually been withdrawn and replaced with something else. I fear to think what that something else could be. Which I tell you in part to bring up a related issue. The rhetoric of Tweety Pie acolytes has been getting more and more violent and dangerous as his coups keep failing in the courts, the legislatures, and in the general public. Tom Zawastowski, the executive director of the Portage County, Ohio Tea Party, took out a full-page ad in the Washington Times calling for Tweety Pie to institute martial law, to toss out the November elections and stage a military-run election for federal offices, stating that if there isn't martial law, quote, we will also have no other choice but to take matters into our own hands and defend our rights on our own. Among those who have effectively endorsed this statement by retweeting it are retired General and former Tweety Pie National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and pro-Trump attorney Lynn Wood. A number of commenters, by the way, have actually noted that the people supporting this ad are entirely okay with overturning the Constitution, but regard having to wear a mask to limit the spread of COVID as fascism. Meanwhile, Tweety Pie lawyer Joe DeGeneva has said former Homeland Security Chris Krebs should be taken out and shot for saying the 2020 election was secure. Lynn Wood tweeted that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger are not sleeping well at night, nor should they. Justice is coming. Steve Bannon recently said that Dr. Anthony Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray should be beheaded. On November 29th, Chris Bedford, senior editor of the right-wing journal The Federalist, called Stacey Abrams dangerous on many levels for her advocacy of expanding voting options for people. And of course, there is Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who was the target of a kidnapping and potential murder plot. Now, DeGeneva is now saying he was merely being rhetorical. Of course he did once he was called out on it. It's the can't you take a joke defense. But words have meaning. Words have impact. On November 25th, Rick Wiles, the senior pastor of the Flowing Streams Church in Florida, said, and I'm quoting him, the Democrats, the news media, if the leftists, if scientists, professors who have been working secretly with the Chinese Communist Party, then line them up against the wall and shoot them, that's what you do with them. Now, do you really think he'd be saying that if the idea hadn't been planted in his head through the constant drumbeat repetition of fraud, fraud, fraud? What happens when someone finally takes this too far and someone gets shot and killed? What if the next plot against the next Gretchen Whitmer is not discovered in time? Will one of these people take any responsibility? No, of course they won't. Of course they won't. Several years ago, I started a list of what I called rules for right-wingers. It started out rather lightheartedly, but as it expanded over time, it got serious. The last incarnation has been in 2017, and this is rule number 12. Never accept responsibility. Whenever faced with the evil resulting from some other winger acting on your words or your arguments, accuse those who point out that fact of politicizing a tragedy. Never, never, never take any responsibility for the meaning of your own words. I have become dangerously close to saying that the very existence of these people, well, all right, no, it's not. I almost said these people. That's not the existence of the people, but the existence of the thought process, the existence of that way of thinking. Its very existence has become a moral outrage, and I need a break. Okay, we're back. I have several things I want to talk about, each of them relatively briefly. The first is that in the last week of November, the right wing gained its first Bugs Bunny Barrett-driven Supreme Court victory, which ruled 5-4 in favor of two religious organizations challenging New York State's restrictions on the number of people attending religious services due to the spread of COVID. The majority ruled in favor of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn and Agudath Israel of America, agreeing that the restrictions violated the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment on the grounds that the regulations treated the houses of worship more harshly than comparable secular facilities. Comparable, in the eyes of the court, meaning a religious service with at least scores, or in one notorious case, thousands of people, often maskless and gathered indoors in an enclosed space for an extended period of time, is essentially the same as a commercial establishment featuring often masked customers coming and going with very few remaining for an extended period of time, and certainly not packed in shoulder to shoulder. The details of the state's regulations and the justice's opinions are actually largely irrelevant for this in the face of two things that stand out to me. One is that the case should have been dismissed as moot because the state had already significantly modified the regulations at issue. It wasn't, on the grounds that the groups remained under a constant threat that the regulations could perhaps be reinstated. This "it can always come up again" standard is one under which a great many cases dismissed as moot should not have been dismissed. Which means it wasn't found moot because the reactionary majority of the court wanted to rule on it, wanted to smack down public health rules because of their ideology of pushing religion into the law. New York Governor Andrew "I'll never be my dad" Cuomo said the court didn't find the case to be moot because the majority wanted to make a statement that this is now a different court, which is actually a different way of saying the same thing. This wasn't about the law or about Constitution, it was about ideology. The other notable point is that the decision was scientifically illiterate, not only because of the idiocy of the comparable facility claim, but because at bottom it relies on the conviction that what happens at a church or synagogue because of their failure to respect public health guidelines affects no one outside that community. It means that even if you want to bizarrely say that religious freedom means we have to allow for the spread of an infectious disease within a religious community, you also have to be saying that those people are incapable of spreading it beyond that community, which is transparent nonsense to the point that just stating it is sufficient refutation. Perhaps dimly aware of that, the majority said there are many other less restrictive rules that could be adopted, but failed to suggest any that are both enforceable and equally effective. In fact, they failed to suggest any alternatives at all, turning unsupported speculation into fact, which I suppose is actually pretty normal for them. The bottom line is that the result of this decision is that being a religious organization entitles you to risk the public health. As Jeffrey Sachs, director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, said of the decision, people will die as a result of this. All right, next up, here's a bit of outrage, very quick, just to make your skin crawl. The US Citizenship Test contains 128 questions. A study guide provides suggested correct answers for each. Of those questions, applicants are asked a randomly selected 20, of which they must get 12 right in order to pass. Okay. Two of the questions of the 128 are, who does a U.S. Senator represent, and who does a member of the House of Representatives represent? Now, for many years, the suggested answer to each was they represent the people in their state or in their district. The 2020 version of the test has changed that to citizens in their state or district. Now, first off, that's wrong. Senators and representatives actually are supposed to represent all of the people in their district, citizen or not. In fact, the House of Representatives website says that in so many words, that they represent the people in their district. But the guide now says citizens, so I can only assume if you answer people or residents or some other such version, you'll be counted as having gotten that question wrong. You know, my God, even in such a cheap, small way, they feel the need to take a slap at non-citizens. If they weren't in such powerful positions, they'd really be pathetic. All right, next up, I don't know when you'll see this, and hopefully it will be a done deal by the time you do, but history says be cautious, so I'm going to cover it even though it may be outdated. GOPper Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana has predicted on December 6th that Tweety Pie and Fish-Face McConnell will wind up backing a $908 billion COVID relief bill being worked out in bipartisan negotiations that actually went around the Senate GOPper leadership and the White House. It includes continuing the ban on evictions, plus money for small business loans and state and local aid, along with renewing the federal unemployment insurance supplement, but at a reduced rate of $300 a week. It would also direct funds for COVID-19 vaccine distribution in schools and transportation centers and so on. The downsides are that it does not include any money to replicate the earlier $1,200 direct payment to individuals, despite its proved effect at reducing COVID-driven poverty, and does include a supposedly temporary federal liability shield for corporations fearful of being sued and held responsible for their COVID-related cruelties and mismanagement. Think, for example, of the people forced at the cost of losing their jobs to continue to work in meatpacking plants without any protective gear. Those failures have led to some, including Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to say they might oppose the bill. Now, as I prepare this, Congress is actually planning to pass a one-week spending bill to keep the government running, with the House voting on December 9th. The idea is to provide more time to nail down the final version of this proposal, which is part of an omnibus spending package. So you may know more about this than I do. Now, a final thought for me on this is that I have to admit this is a case where I differ from Bernie and AOC. The corporate protection is truly odious, but I think the need is so great that we're at the point where you take what you can get and hope for some surprisingly good news on January 5th. All right, next, on December 8th, the Supreme Court rejected an appeal by Pennsylvania GOPpers to block certification of the state's presidential vote. It was done in an unsigned one-line note with no noted dissents. I can hear the justices saying, "Do you get it now? Go away." And I honestly expect the same treatment to be given to the utterly insane move by Texas to sue Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin at the Supreme Court on the grounds that the changes they made to their election procedures because of the pandemic was illegal. There's simply no way in hell that Texas has standing to bring this suit. The question becomes, then what's the point of all these suits? I mean, they know they can't win. They know, in fact, that even if they win, they will still lose because enough states certified the results before the safe harbor date of December 8th to give Joe Biden the 270 electoral votes he needs, after which those results are almost immune to challenge. So, other than proving they're sufficiently wacko and sufficiently devoted to Tweety Pie's personality cunt to survive in the modern GOPper party, it's hard to see the point. Which means, in fact, that probably is the point. All right, last time I said the emerging trend of who Joe Biden wants in his cabinet was not encouraging. I haven't had much reason to change that view in the time since. For one thing, I said that perhaps the worst potential pick was deficit hawk Bruce Reed for director of the Office of Management and Budget, calling appointing someone like that to head the OMB in the midst of an economy-wrecking pandemic is just insane. Well, Biden didn't nominate him. He nominated Neera Tanden, who was Reid's assistant during the Clinton administration. Described as a Clinton loyalist with a penchant for demonizing progressives, Tanden supports something called Medicare for America, a corporate-friendly alternative to Medicare for all, and she has a history of supporting cuts in Social Security and Medicare. Next, Biden has picked Brian Deese as director of the National Economic Council, a position that doesn't require confirmation. Deese is managing director and global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, the world's largest financial backer for fossil fuel projects. Environmental activists have been trying for years to get BlackRock to disinvest from such projects. Deese's job has been to counteract them, and now he heads the National Economic Council. Now, I really have to wonder how deep is Biden's commitment to battling climate change. His plan is certainly a dramatic improvement over what we've seen to date, improvement enough to get support from various environmental groups. But the real issue isn't if it's better, it's if it's good enough. And I'd say that anyone who pointedly refuses, as Biden and Harris have both done, pointedly refuses to ban fracking, the whole point of which is to continue support on fossil fuels, I wonder if such a person actually is sufficiently serious. The pick of Deese only adds to those doubts. As does reports that fossil fuel-friendly Ernest Moniz, a supporter of nuclear power, is the leading contender for Secretary of Energy, and Heidi Heitkamp, who has aligned herself with corporate interests and fossil fuel interests, is top of the list for Secretary of Agriculture. Meanwhile, Mike Morell is on the short list to head the CIA, and Morell is an aggressive defender of this agency's use of torture and drone strikes, who dismisses reports of civilian casualties as propaganda. There is one bright spot. Xavier Becerra, the Attorney General of California, is going to head up the Department of Health and Human Services. He's not a health professional, but he does have an extensive administrative background and an overall progressive record, and has expressed support for Medicare for all. All right. We're going to end this time with one last quick look at the election. To note not only that according to one analysis, the Democrats may have done about as good down ballot as they might have, and the predictions of large gains were more a matter of being overly optimistic than of facts on the ground. But more importantly, as Jim Hightower points out, for all the hand-wringing about down-ballot losses, 2020 was hardly a debacle, and for progressives in particular, it actually wasn't that bad a year. For one thing, there were about a dozen more progressives in Congress than there were in the last session, making it harder for the establishment Democratic Party to continue its long practice of sidelining progressive proposals, not that they won't continue to try. Progressives also won hundreds of local offices, including, significantly, a number of races for sheriffs, district attorneys, and other criminal justice positions, including across the South. It's an illustration of the growing, slowly growing, but growing progressive prosecutor movement, taking criminal justice reform, a publicly popular and 2020 showed election-winning program, directly to the nuts and bolts of the system. Not only in unexpected areas such as California, but the New York Times reports in cities and counties in Georgia, Florida, Michigan, Texas, Colorado, and Ohio, in each case overcoming the predictable and expected opposition from police unions. So we should, plagiarizing Joe Hill, not mourn but organizing. Think of 2020 as one of the 101 blows against the rock in the old parable of the stonemason, and carry it on. So that's it for now. We will see you in 2 weeks with our special holiday show. In the meantime, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.